When's the last time that you marveled at something you might describe as beautifully incomprehensible? For some, maybe they were gazing out at the night sky, considering the vastness of the universe God chose to make. He didn't have to make the universe as large and as vast as he did. And he didn't have to make it as beautiful as he did, but he did. And there's so much out there that mankind will never know all. It is truly incomprehensible. Or maybe we know someone who has dealt with severe, serious trauma, whether that was from their childhood, whether that's from a loss or abuse, and yet they still did find joy in life. And they still are able to smile despite the intense hardship they've experienced. For me, when I think about this idea, I often think about when Alethea was born and holding her for the first time. And I know many parents have expressed a similar experience. When you hold your first child, there is this new rush of emotion that's hard to convey. This sudden wonder and joy and excitement at being a parent that I don't know how to put into words other than saying you have to experience it for yourself. It is beautifully incomprehensible. And I bring up those different scenarios because there is something in Ephesians 3 that God says falls into that category. He says that, and picking up in verse 17, so that Christ might dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to all the fullness of God. And so here is God saying that he wants us to understand his love. He wants us to understand the love of Jesus. But he also says it surpasses knowledge. God basically says, I want you to know something that isn't quite fully comprehensible. And it almost seems kind of like a paradox. So this is not our main text for today, but I bring this text up to make this point that what our main text is Colossians 3, verse 14, where he says, in addition to all those other things we're talking about, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, gentleness, humility, patience. He says, on top of all of that, or over all of that, to all these things put on love, which is a perfect bond of unity. Love is such an incomprehensible thing, something that surpasses knowledge. There's no single lesson or even 100 lessons that could truly plumb the depths of what love is, to cover the vastness of God's love and how that looks like in the life of the believer. You will spend your entire life and maybe even all of eternity growing in your understanding of this concept. So how in the world do we make a single lesson on this? Well, what we're going to do is focus on the part Paul gives us in Colossians, because he doesn't just say, put on love. He does give us a little bit more information, and he says what is on his mind is that love is the perfect bond of unity. Now, some versions may translate a little bit differently, because most literally translated, you could translate this as love, which is the bond of perfection. And so that will be our focal point. What does Paul mean by saying love is the bond of perfection? What application does it have for our lives? How is it supposed to look in our lives? What are we supposed to be doing? How do we live this out? And so as we wrestle with this, acknowledging there's lots of aspects of love we're not going to get to touch on today because it's so deep and so rich, and there's no way we can do that in a single lesson. We're going to be looking at this concept. What does this mean? So let's start with some of the fundamental points, things that you are probably already connecting before, and you don't need me to point out to you, because in the context of Colossians, he's had this heart that has these 5 components we're told to put on, and he says love is over all of that. And so some of the things that is kind of fundamental is the recognition, and this is the way I decided to say it here, love is more than a feeling, and it is more than an action. I'll explain the second part in just a minute. But the first part is probably not surprising to you. I grew up where the media landscape, movies, books, were emphasizing the emotional component of love. I call it one of the last moral idols in the world of Western thought, because media will told you greed for money is bad, greed for power is bad, greed for popularity is bad, but if you want to make marriage and love your idol, that's totally okay. And they emphasize the emotional experience of love. And so growing up, I heard lots of lessons making the point that love is more than an action. And that makes sense because we had it as a scripture reading. Won't read it. I'll just highlight a couple pieces from it. The very definition of love that Paul writes down in 1 Corinthians 13 makes that point. The vast majority of things he says that he describes love as are actions. So he says love does not act in a disgraceful way. It does not seek its own. If you jump down to verse 6, it rejoices with the truth. At the end, it endures all things. So when you look at God's very definition of love, then absolutely love is more than an emotion. It's more than just feeling. However, I also say it's more than just action, because if you look at the intro to this definition, the first 3 verses, I want you to notice a couple things. Again, won't read it because we read it for scripture reading. But in verse 2, he stresses that if he has the gift of prophecy. We didn't read this, but in chapter 14, Paul's going to say prophecy is a benefit. It is a gift, and it edifies the church when you use it properly. And he's actually said it's better than speaking in tongues. And so he speaks very highly of prophecy in the very next chapter of this context. But in this verse, he says, if I can prophesy, but do not have love, I am nothing. So I can do this action that benefits other people, but I can do that without love. And if so, I am nothing. The next verse Paul makes it the clearest, verse 3, where he says, if I give away all of my possessions, and technically to charity is not in the text, I do think that is the obvious thought he has here, that he's giving all of us away to benefit God, to serve God, to benefit others. If I give away all of my stuff, and if I surrender my body, and that I may glory is probably the most literal translation, though many versions will translate as that it may be burned. It does seem to be the idea of martyrdom. He's giving up his life to follow Jesus. He says, if I give away all my stuff, and if I surrender my body, but do not have love, it does me no good. He's painting the picture that he can be generous without love, that he can be a martyr without love, that he can do these acts that benefit other people and do so without love. And if that is the case, it is worthless, at least to himself. I mean, maybe someone else is somewhat benefited by his actions, but not Paul. And that's why I say love is more than a feeling and it's more than an action. It is both. That to truly be loving someone, both of those pieces need to be there. The action and the emotion. Now, given the context of the previous section where he talks about these characteristics of the heart we're supposed to wear, one of the things that, again, probably don't need me pointing out to you, is that he's saying that love is the glue that holds all of these together. That you should be seeing my love through my compassion and through my kindness and through my humility. It permeates all of that. You can kind of think of the analogy of when you glue 2 pieces of wood together. When God creates wood, everything God makes is pretty amazing, but wood is, and to me, very fascinating. That one of the reasons glue works with wood is because it most of the time seeps deeper than just the surface. It actually seeps into the fibers of the wood, and when it bonds to the other piece, it permeates at least into the beginning layers of each side, and thus holds it together. This is the picture that he's painting. Love is the bond that takes all those other characteristics and connects them to each other, that completes them, that perfects them. And that if I'm showing compassion and mercy and kindness and humility without love, 1 Corinthians verses 1 through 13, 1 through 3, it does me no good, and I am nothing. So again, an idea that probably you were able to connect before I pointed it out. And also, probably not surprising, partially because I quote 1 Timothy 1:5 all the time, where Paul says the goal of our instruction is love. The end goal or striving toward in our teaching is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And so it's not surprising that Paul would have this idea of perfection or completion, we'll talk more about that in just a second, to love. But if you remember the Ephesians 3 passage we quoted, there's a strange thing about this. Because in Ephesians 3, he says, I want you to be rooted and grounded in love. It's a foundational, fundamental concept. And yet, that root and ground is supposed to help you grow to understand that it's far beyond something you're understanding. You can see a similar point when you reference what Jesus says in Matthew 22, when he says that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, upon these two rest the whole law and the prophets. That everything else in the Old Covenant sits on the foundation of those two commands. And so in that language, it's foundational. It is first principles. And yet you have texts such as 1 Timothy 1 that says the goal we're striving to is love. So love is a strange concept and strange principle that is fundamental to my life as a Christian, but also an endeavor, or maybe the endeavor of my life as a Christian. It permeates the whole thing. And so there's this weird reality, and hopefully by the end of the lesson, it makes a little bit more sense how that can be the case. How can it be a first principle, but also the end goal as well? But that's something that you probably aren't surprised because there's several verses that make this point that you are to strive to greater love. But if you note Paul's description, his emphasis doesn't quite seem to be on the previous 5 ideas, and it doesn't seem to be on the perfection or the end goal idea. Because notice he says love is the bond. It is the joint. It is the connection of perfection. So the phrase of perfection is describing the bond. The bond is the main concept. And so that is the focal point of our question today. What does he mean, the bond of perfection? Well, this word bond, sundesmos, isn't used a whole lot. If I remember correctly, it's used only about 4 times in the New Testament in this form. And one of the times is actually in the previous chapter of Colossians, in Colossians chapter 2. In chapter 2:19, he says, is the context where Paul's warning them about being deceived and taken away from Christ. He's afraid they're going to be led away from the truth. He says, not holding firmly to the head, from whom the entire body being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments grows with a growth which is from God. That word ligaments is the same word translated as bond over in chapter 3. Another place is where it shows up, I believe, when Peter confronts Simon the sorcerer and says, you're in the bondage of iniquity. I think it's the same word. I have to go double check that, but I think that's the same word. So it's translated as a couple of different ways. But in this context, you have this idea of something holding things together, a ligament that holds your joints, that holds your bones, holds your muscles together, connects everything. And in this context, results in growth, which comes from God. So here is a kind of a core concept we can appeal to. And as we noted that we'd be talking about the idea of perfection. This word, this is the noun, it's the thing, it's the concept versus the verb, the action, or the adjective that describes other things. There's only 2 times this word in this form gets used. Here and over in Hebrews 6, beginning of Hebrews 6, where he says, let us press on to maturity, to completion, to perfection. However, teleos, the adjective, the describing word, gets used a bunch. If you are reading the New Testament and you see the word perfect or complete, it is almost always the word teleos, and this is the noun form of teleos, the concept form of teleos. And so even though we only have 2 cases where this word shows up, we have a lot of usages for this word family. And you even see it in verb form where you are completing something, you're perfecting something. And so he says, love is this bond, this ligament that causes the growth of perfection. And what is that supposed to look like? What does that mean? What is that really the way we're supposed to be seeing this? And the most helpful text to unpacking this idea comes out of Ephesians. Now, you may know Ephesians and Colossians are often called sister letters. And the reason is that Paul is both in prison when he writes these two. He apparently writes them at the same time because Tychicus is the carrier of both of these letters. You'll see that in Ephesians 6 and Colossians 4. But also when you read them, you realize the ideas and the concepts that permeate throughout each of these books are incredibly similar, sometimes using the same phrases. The points he's making is different in each book, but he uses the same concept and packages them differently to make different points, but uses the same concepts. Remember our Colossians 2:19 passage as we read these verses. Ephesians 4:11, and he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man. Pause right there. That is not our noun form from Colossians of perfection or completion, but it is the adjective. It's teleos. And so you could translate this as the perfect man, the complete man, the teleos man. They decide to translate mature here, but same word family, same word concept as over in Colossians. That we're striving, the building of the body is striving toward this maturity, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of people, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, that's our same word that shows in Colossians, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, that is Christ. Notice how similar that is to 2:19. It talks about the head, it talks about growing up into the head, it talks about how people are bonded through that head. That's verse 15. Pick up in 16 again with me. From whom the whole body being fitted and held together by what every joint. Now I highlight this. This is not our word syndesmos. That would be very convenient if it was, but it is the same word for joint over in Colossians 2:19. So when it says joints and ligaments, ligaments being our bond word, but joint shows up same word. And so notice it's being used in a very similar context in the same kind of way as over in Colossians. So held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Notice how you have this kind of fundamental starting point and also this conclusion point with love again, right? You're speaking the truth in love so that everything else that follows these verses happens. So what can happen? So you have the building up of the body in love, a fundamental concept and an end goal concept seen here as well. So what do we take away from this passage? How does this passage help us understand what Paul's saying in Colossians? Well, we highlighted 4:13 where he talks about the mature man. And again, this is not a surprising point probably for most of you because we've made this point recently in sermons and classes, but perfection, maturity, the complete human is Jesus. That you and I are supposed to look like Jesus, sound like Jesus, act like Jesus. People should see us. This is Colossians 3:11. Christ is all and in all. When people see us, they should see Jesus. And part of what Paul's saying is that love being the bond of perfection, just like he's saying here in Ephesians, is that the driving goal, the measurement, the standard we're striving toward is to look like Jesus. And love is driving us in that direction. It is transforming us to be Christ-like. Love is the most fundamental concept that will make us look more like Jesus than anything else we do, anything else we think, anything else we feel. That the goal of love is to change us into Christ-like beings, to press to that mature person. And then we highlighted Ephesians 4:16, where he uses the word joint. We have this bond language, right? Things are connected, things are joined together. And as we highlighted the word joint, same word as joints over in Colossians 2:19. But what is this telling us about the bond of perfection, the ligament of perfection from Colossians 3? He's saying that love is the bond that builds the whole body into greater love. Another way to say that is the reason love exists, as God's explaining it in Colossians 3 and Ephesians 4 here, and we will flesh this out more in just a second, give you some kind of down-to-earth ideas to connect to. But love bonds people and concepts together for the maturing of myself and others in love. It is the fundamental concept that leads to furtherance of its own existence. So here's what I mean by that. Here's some more down-to-earth ways to think about this. Our love, my call to love, my command to love by God is incomplete as long as anyone else in God's body is not perfected in love. My love is incomplete. It is unfinished. It is not done until others are perfected. It is the bond, it is the ligament, it is the combination of perfection. In Ephesians 4, the whole body is joined together so that each individual part is supplying what it needs to supply to build up the body in love, to build toward the mature man, the mature Jesus. I didn't stress this point earlier, but if you asked me to define love in a single word or a single concept, this is incomplete, but it would be the word sacrifice. Because if you look at the definition of love in Colossians 13, each of these has the idea that I am sacrificing for the well-being of someone else. There's a deep connection to compassion here. And so what this means in my life, if I'm going to put love above all things, make it the glue that holds it all together, it is going to be the thing that drives me to sacrifice for your growth. In our Western world, it's really, really easy to believe that Christianity is an individualistic affair. Now, you will not answer for my conduct. You will not be judged on my choices. You will not have to answer to God for why I did X, Y, and Z. You will only have to do that for yourself. Ezekiel 18 makes that very, very plain. But part of what God's calling you to and me to is to make sacrifices so that I can help you grow and you can help me grow. What you see in this is one of the things we will answer to God for is, did I love my brethren? And the particular point he's thinking about here, the particular aspect of love in this concept, is did I care about their spiritual development? Did I take action to benefit them spiritually? Did I make sacrifices so that others could grow? Did I build up the body in love? Breaking that down, love, remember Colossians 3, we start Colossians 3 with this idea that you're going to seek the things above and then set your mind on things above. Love is the bond, because that's what he says. Love is the bond of perfection. It is the bond that drives me to perfect all of my actions and drives you to perfect all of your actions, not for self. Love does not seek its own. The reason I want to perfect myself isn't for me. It's not because I want to be good and I want to be right and I want to do all the things correctly. If I am being driven by love, the reason I care about perfection and completion and maturity is for you and for God. I reference this all the time, but this is the thing that I realized from John 13 when Jesus is told, the story about Jesus is told, he bends down, he washes the apostles' feet, and he says, do like I've done to you, and he concludes that with the famous text, the world will know you are my disciples because of your love for one another. I realized my view of Christianity had been that it's about me being a good person, about me doing the right thing, about me being loyal and faithful to God, about me worshiping correctly, following God, not harming others, helping others. And I walked out of the room realizing I was absolutely wrong about that. Because Christianity, the gospel, is not about me. If love is the fundamental concept, it means it's about others. And I will do all of those things, then pragmatically, my life isn't going to look a whole lot different. But the way I think about it, my motivation, my mindset, my emotions are going to be absolutely, radically, unconnectably different. the way I think about my sacrifices, the willingness of my sacrifices. If I want to perfect myself, if I want to mature myself, if I want to complete myself for the benefit of others, my attitude is totally different. And that then affects my mindset. It changes my mind from about me being a good person to how do I love well? I care about perfecting, completing, maturing so that I can love well. It's not about me. But it's not just me individualistically. The love is changing. It's not just bonding compassion and humility and kindness and gentleness. It's doing all of those things. And thus perfecting me. But it is also driving me to care about you, about your growth, your development, your success in the kingdom. And this is all wrapped together. When he says the bond of perfection, I want you to feel the gravity of that statement. It is so deep. It is so rich. The vastness of the universe cannot contain the entirety of what that means. It connects everything, every thought, every action, every person in God's kingdom is connected through this bond of perfection, the love. And so the application here is, what are you supplying? What ligament are you? And I chose to say that because I figured you remember that more than just the question, what are you supplying? Which ligament are you? That's the language he uses in Colossians 2:19. As a language he uses, what joint are you in Ephesians 4? How are you supplying and building up the body? For love to be perfected in you, you take a vested interest in the growth of your brethren. And it's a fair question to ask, and we do not have time to unpack it. What does it mean to build up the body? All I'm going to say about that is I'm going to share these verses and give you a few minutes to copy them down, take a picture. Want to send me to send you an email? I will. Be happy to send you an email so that you don't have to write it down. These 6 passages use this language of building up the temple, building up the body, building his people, Matthew 16. And they give you ideas of what this is about, what this means. If you think I need to do a whole lesson on it, let me know. If we need to unpack this in a sermon format, let me know. I will do that. But that's all I'm going to share. So go read those, think about those, ask this question: what does building the body look like? What does it mean? All I'm going to do is highlight Colossians 1:9-12, because that's the book we're in. We're in Colossians. And before we look at the text, I'm going to remind you in verse 3 and verse 4, Paul is thanking God for the Colossians and his 2 primary reasons he has: for their faith and for their love for all the saints. And then if you probably remember, it's been a long time since we looked at this text together, but in verse 8, he ends by saying Epaphras has told us about the love that you have. And so he opens this paragraph in 3 through 8, and he ends it with this concept that Paul is thankful for their love. And then he says in verse 9, because of their faith, because of their love, for this reason, we also, since the day we heard about it, have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. The main point of Colossians, Paul's goal, because he's thankful for the love and he is encouraged by the love and the faith of the Colossians, he's praying for them to be filled with the knowledge of God's will, with all spiritual wisdom and understanding. But not just for knowledge's sake. God never asks us to know knowledge for the sake of knowledge alone. There's always some reason, some further goal God has in mind, and that's true here. Verse 10, so that he will walk in a worthy manner of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for the attaining of all perseverance and patience, joyously giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. So, where do you fit in here? What is your role in the body? How do you carry out this job to be a part of the body that builds up the other parts in love? Maybe you're helping people understand the knowledge of God's will by so that they will walk in a way worthy of God. Or maybe you're challenging people, encouraging people to please others to please Him in all respects. Or maybe you're showing people, inviting people to do good works with you. Come join me as I do this spiritual work. Come join me as I help this brother or sister. Come join me as I fill in the blank. Maybe you are meeting people over meals or over coffee, or you're just doing work together. And while you're doing that good work together, you're trying to make sure that they know God better, that they learn about God, what you've learned about God, and maybe they're doing the same thing for you. That you're with people who feel beaten down and you're trying to strengthen them so that they can attain perseverance and patience. You're there when they're crying. You're there when they're beaten down. You're there when they have the weight of the world on their shoulders to help them bear that weight so they can develop perseverance and patience. That you are trying to exemplify or encourage them to give thanks joyously to the Father. What ligament are you? Because you cannot claim to be a person of love and be an individualistic Christian. Can't do it. The picture you see in Colossians, it is the bond, it is the joint connection of perfection that drives to completion, that drives to maturity in self and in my brethren. But it's not for me. It's because I care about others. God wants us to draw closer to Christ, become more like Christ, because He loves us and He wants us to be with Him. We often make the point when Matthew 7 is misquoted. The world will quote Matthew 7 and says, "You can't judge me. You can't tell me I'm wrong. The Bible says don't judge." And we will point out that, well, that's actually not the full context. He says, if you have a plank sticking out of your eye, you need to remove that. Don't try to be fixing someone else's speck when you have a plank. He does say that. But he then says, remove the plank so that you will see clearly to remove the speck. And we'll make that point when people misquote that, but do we actually live that way? Do we actually believe that once my plank is removed, or once someone else's plank is removed, that it's their job to remove my specks, and my job to remove their specks? Because that's what Paul's saying here, that love drives us to that. And it's not about being right, and it's not about, it's important to be right, but it's not about me being right. That's not the endeavor. That's not the concern. It's about people growing into Christ. And that's why I try to equip each other. Right? This is verse 11 of Ephesians 4, that apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors are to equip saints so the saints will build up the body. To train saints to do this kind of thing. So what role do you play? And we've made this point a lot recently, but the vast majority of this will probably not happen inside the four walls of the assembly place. Some of it does, but the role you play may largely take place outside of these four walls. And it might not be a public teaching scenario. But there's a role you're supposed to be playing. You are going to put love on top of all those other characteristics. You're going to be building up the body in love. And if you need help figuring out what that role is, what your talents are, and how to utilize them, and you want public prayers about that, you can let us know. Or you can talk to people who you think are doing well in the thing you know you should be doing. Look to your older brethren who are doing this well and go to them and say, how did you learn to do that? What are you doing? How do I develop that? Please show me how to do this good work. Can I do it with you? Because Jesus died to make us a part of that body. To put on love the way He does. to become servants the way he was a servant. So the world will know that we are his disciples because of the love for one another. If you have any spiritual need, please let us know as we stand and as we sing.